An ancestral home steeped in historical intrigue. Lady Victoria Leatham reveals its airs and graces.
Berkeley has been described as being an enchanted place, of having beauty in a rough, uncouth way. Many things have been written about this house. Shakespeare refers to it and says in Richard II that the high, wild hills and rough, uneven ways would make the king and his companion wearisome. You can imagine the king and his little party of followers making their way across the low-lying marshy land and arriving at this great, enormous building, huge even then. Cromwell, of course, in the Civil War, attacked the castle. He breached the wall and left it indefensible. And in fact, that repair has never been done. It's always been left as it was. It was not permitted to repair the damage that Cromwell did. When you look at this almost impenetrable structure built to defend the western marches against the Welsh, here situated between Gloucester and Bristol, it's hard to imagine it ever being the home of men of peace. But of course this was the case. The Berkeleys are being immensely successful at getting themselves on the right side when any political struggle loomed, unlike a lot of stately homeowners that we visited in the past. Berkeley Castle was built in the 14th century by a man called Robert Fitzharding, a wealthy Bristol merchant. Today it's owned by Mr. Robert John Berkeley, a lineal descendant of the builder, but 24 generations down the line. An amazing record for any house. Berkeley still looks very much as it did in the 14th century. It's still a fortress, it's still defensive, a little forbidding and a little menacing perhaps. The family who live here, however, have taken certain steps to soften it down a bit so that it does become a family home as well as a fortress. They've managed to make the rooms inside much more comfortable than they were in the time of the 5th Earl, when a page was sent here to look at the bedroom assigned to the Prince of Wales. He was absolutely shocked and appalled at what he saw. It was far too dark and far too gloomy for his royal master. However, it was pointed out, no doubt with some considerable asperity by the steward, that this was a castle and not one of these modern, airy, light buildings. This is definitely Berkeley's grandest room, an amazing baronial state banqueting hall. Now, of course, you'd expect a medieval castle perhaps to have a room like this. After all, the knights and barons had to have somewhere to do all their feasting. But it always amazes me the size of these buildings, particularly the roofs, the way that they're constructed. This one contains some rather nice shaped timbers in between the main rafters here, and I gather that they're called wind braces. It perhaps gives us an idea that in days of past, and perhaps even now, this castle gets a terrific battering from the western gales that come up the Severn Estuary. It's difficult to make a room like this homely. You begin to wonder, how do you do that? How do you make it the centre of the family? It's fine when everybody's sitting here feasting. It's obviously very full of people and light and jollity. But when it's not, when it's just the family sitting at home, perhaps you need a little softening touch. What they've done is very sensibly to soften the stone walls by hanging tapestries on them. Now, this is good for two reasons. One is that they obviously improve the look of the room here. They bring the walls in towards the middle visually. They stop it feeling so cold and spare. But also, it gives the family a chance to actually hang things, which perhaps there isn't another room at Berkeley that they could do this in. After all, these tapestries are all 14 feet high, and there aren't too many rooms here that have walls that height to actually display something like that. Now, two walls are covered with tapestries, fine. The third wall is covered with windows. Wonderful lancet windows full of golden and green and red and blue stained glass. I can't imagine a more beautiful sight than seeing all these brilliant colours shining in candlelight reflected from the tables during a feast or a dinner. Now, the fourth wall of this great hall is absolutely full of painted decoration. This is this extraordinary minstrel's gallery and screen. Now, I say extraordinary advisedly because this is very unusual to find traces of original decoration in a house such as this. It must have taken all the self-control that the Victorians had to stop them painting it in thick brown gunge, as we've seen in other houses. But here it is in wonderful glowing colours, the red, the white and the black. Not a very extensive palette, but certainly enough to enliven this end of the hall. We've also got certain bits of writing here, mostly religious tracts urging the people who went out to battle here to come back all in one piece. Of course, you can't talk about this wall and ignore the carving and the doors. Now, the carving on here is absolutely first class. It's probably the best I've certainly ever seen. Double linen fold, single linen fold, armorial, and beautiful, beautiful tracery up here. Absolutely exquisite. Whoever made these doors really knew what they were doing, and they were making them for show, for the great baronial hall. Now, the other side of the door is a different question altogether, because that is extremely crude, to put it mildly. It's made almost of just planks of trees set next door to each other with this amazing lock on it. This is what I enjoy about this sort of job. I get to play with things like this. Bolts like this are not the sort of thing you come across every day. It was made by a man probably in the village. Can you imagine the steward of the castle going down and saying to him, "George, we've got a bit of a problem. You know, these new doors just come for the great hall. They're not shutting properly. We want something going to be really solid and firm." And the chap sitting there scratching his head saying, "Well, I don't know, I think if I take a long piece of metal and I heat it up in the fire and I just bend it a bit and I just hammer the end and I put it in two hasps like this, that just about should do the trick." It's a wonderful piece of engineering. Berkeley's so lucky because it has so much of the original building remaining. It hasn't been messed about with. They are still here, just as they were when all those knights feasted in here so many years ago. Magnificent. One of the more unattractive facets of old castles such as this is the way in which they used to treat their prisoners. Now, people were captured for various reasons, whether because they were on a different political party or because they'd been caught poaching or for whatever reason it was. They were absolutely brutal to people that they had in their care. There was no concern for them at all. At Berkeley, there is a very strange structure, a deep pit which goes way down into the ground. The story goes that what they would do is to throw down the carcasses of animals into this pit, which, needless to say, would rot, particularly in the summer. The heat and the flies and the stench would have been unbearable. Finally, when the prisoners succumbed to this treatment, their bodies were added to the heap of rotting carcasses down the bottom of the pit. But for kings, the torture was worse. Something really horrible was in store for them. The story goes that King Edward II actually met his end here at Berkeley, and I'll show you where. For sheer brutality, the murder of King Edward II has to be one of the worst examples ever recorded in British history. He was kept here as a prisoner in this room at Berkeley Castle when the ceiling was much lower than it is today, and they had to put him to death in this room in the most horrible and bloodthirsty way. A red-hot poker was inserted into his bowels to minimize the signs of exterior violence. And the sadness of it is that once the crime had been committed and the body was lying here at Berkeley, nobody would accept responsibility for it. This prison of his is a horrible room. The atmosphere is very cold and very threatening. The walls seem to have absorbed some of the torture and agony suffered by him at his hour of death. It's a horrible place, and I'm glad to be getting out of it.
Nowadays, the present owner, John Berkeley, is much more likely to have nightmares about preserving the life of the building than the killing of kings.
There's a small chapel which we still use in the keep, but this was the main chapel. And it's a very famous room. There's, if you say a prayer in here, I'm told you get off goodness knows how many days in purgatory when you die.
Right? Remind me before I go.
Yes.
I have to be on my knees for about half an hour.
But I must apologize because you see these pit props here, these props holding up the roof. They've been here for nearly 3 years now, and waiting for them to sprout any moment while we await a grant. But we've got problems with this room. It's tilted at some stage. We've got to tilt it back the other way. And also we're going to, at the same time, restore the ceiling, the painted ceiling in here, which is, in fact, a very famous one. It's medieval, 14th century. And all the paintwork you see up on the beams is the original paintwork. The castle is basically Norman, as you know, but some of the rooms on this side of it are 14th century. But it's been virtually untouched since then. I mean, the windows have been widened to make it more comfortable and so on, but it's virtually untouched.
And Victorians didn't get at it.
No, thank goodness.
So when you first saw Berkeley, what was your initial impression of the house? Did you love it straight away?
I did. The thing I think everyone's struck by when they come to the castle is the atmosphere, which is very sort of timeless and warm and comfortable.
In spite of all the murders and
In
things?
spite of all that, yes. I mean, one nasty moment, I suppose, and I never ever think of there being anything nasty about the castle.
Was it difficult to make it into a family home, or was it already one? So
No,
it was
already very well organised, with bathrooms to every bedroom, and one of which Lady Berkeley bought from the Waldorf Astoria, New York.
She didn't?
Well, she bought, it was the walls, which are all marble, and the Roman frieze, which goes all the way around above it. And then there's the basin, which is marble, and the bath, which sits in the middle of the room, and that's marble as well. And so I suppose it all came and was put up in sort of blocks.
It's just installed?
It is the coldest bathroom, actually, in the house.
Is it?
Yes, because the windows don't shut very well, and it's all marble, so...
You have to be pretty hardy to get in there.
You have to be quite hardy. I put a fire there, but it takes about 5 hours to warm the room.
Now, this tree looks very venerable. Is it as old as it looks?
This was bought as a seedling from the battlefield of Flodden by the Berkeley, who was fighting the Scots at that time, and it was planted here. It's marvellous.
It obviously likes being down here.
It likes being here.
Wisteria growing up the side of the castle.
It's a wonderful one. I mean, in summer when it was flowering, it came down, it's a blue one, and it looks just like a waterfall coming down the side of the castle.
It's beautiful.
These are the old lead sinks here, and we've never been very worried about lead poisoning here. A lot of the pipes and so on are still lead.
Your gums aren't blue by any chance, are they?
I haven't looked lately. I hope not.
Terrifying.
And then we go on through into the kitchen. The heat from the fire goes up the chimney and turns a fan up inside the chimney, and that turns the mechanism which turns the spirit.
That's unbelievably good engineering, isn't it?
It's very, very remarkable. The ceiling in here is interesting, like a spider's web. The story goes that it was brought here after the Berkeleys defeated the Shrewsburys at Nibley Green, and they then went to their manor house at Wootton near here and pinched their ceiling off the kitchen and brought it here. So
it's quite a trophy, isn't it?
Quite a trophy.
During the latter part of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, a social scandal erupted which involved the Berkeleys of Berkeley Castle. The 5th Earl of Berkeley became deeply infatuated with a beautiful girl, Mary Cole. Now, the problem was that she was the daughter of a butcher and he was the Earl of Berkeley Castle. An enormous social gap existed between the two of them. And yet he was determined to have an affair with this girl. So they hatched a very complicated plot. It involved her sister, Sarah Turner, who was no better than she should have been, living under the protection of a gentleman in London, but not married to him. Mary went to stay with her sister, and they were sitting having supper one evening in front of the fire, talking as sisters do, when suddenly the door burst open and 2 ruffians entered, and they seized Mary's sister and shouted that they needed 100 guineas to let her go because she owed debts. Mary fainted clean away. As if by magic, the Earl of Berkeley appeared from behind a screen with precisely 100 guineas on his person, which Mary was just awake enough to see him offer to the ruffians, and her sister was freed. At this point, of course, poor Mary, very young and innocent, was so overcome with gratitude to the noble Earl that she said, "Do with me as you will." Indeed, he did. He whisked her off to a house of his not far away in London. They formed an alliance and in due course went through a bogus marriage ceremony. Now, this was very much at the instigation of the 5th Earl himself. He was a bit of a cad. He managed to persuade Mary that this ceremony, however it was formed, was in fact legal, and she believed this for a short enough time for a child to be born, and then another child to be born, and in fact it went on for 7 children. But by this stage she was well aware of the fact that the first marriage was not legal. In 1798, an act was passed whereby William Pitt gave 10% tax allowance on the first 5 legitimate children of any marriage. This inspired the Earl to start regularizing affairs. So they were married in the local church, but that didn't solve the problem. The first children were still illegitimate, including the heir, Fitzharding, Lord Fitzharding, their eldest child, who they adored and whom they wanted to install here as Earl of Berkeley and Lord of the estate. So they hatched a very clumsy plot here in this castle to try and forge a marriage entry for that early wedding, which had never really taken place. The major problem they had to overcome was the fact that there were no banns published in the parish register. Just about 200 years ago today, Mary, her brother William, who'd witnessed that first false marriage, and Lord Berkeley made their way up these little sneaky stairs to Mary's dressing room, right at the top of the house. So they locked themselves away in this little room. They put up an extra blind at the windows to make sure that nobody from the rest of the castle could see in and see what they were up to. Now, the only person who was left in the castle at that time, everybody else after all had gone to church, was the governess with the 2 younger children. She was obviously a very nosy Parker. She liked to know what was going on, and she was not a great admirer of Mary's. She sent one of the little boys up to bang on the door, and he was sent away by his mother, a most unusual occurrence. And this confirmed in the governess's mind that something most strange was going on. I think we can safely assume that what they were up to was a rather clumsy forgery in the parish register. What they were trying to do was desperately to prove that the first marriage had been legal, and to this end they needed bans and signatures of witnesses and all that sort of thing, all of which they added very clumsily by hand. They made a fatal mistake of pasting this false piece of paper upside down at the beginning of the register. They also put page 74 on the bottom of it, even though there was another page 74 already existing. A most naive and clumsy attempt to falsify the records. It was in the end all to no avail. The case was brought by Fitz after his father's death, but he didn't win it. It went to the House of Lords and they just threw it out. He never managed to establish himself with the title of Lord of Berkeley. He did in fact inherit the house, and at the point that he moved in, his mother moved out, to live 34 years of widowhood at the other family house at Cranford in Middlesex. It's perhaps just as well that Mary wasn't around to see what a mess Fitz made of his life, a drunken, wasted life it was. His greatest claim to fame was that he fathered 33 illegitimate children within the near environs of Berkeley Castle. Quite a record. The 5th Earl of Berkeley wasn't just famous for his messy marriage and his illegitimate children. He was also a passionate huntsman. He began the Berkeley Hounds, an enormous country which stretched all the way from Berkeley in the south right the way up to London, Charing Cross in fact. It was such a huge country that they had to keep 2 packs of hounds and hunt it for months at a time to cover all the ground. Now, Bricket Wood was one of the places they used to meet at, and this picture shows very well the sort of pandemonium that was considered to be absolutely essential of hunting in those days. You can see the yellow coats of hunt servants. Now, that was something particular to the Berkeley. They were the only pack that hunted with yellow hunt servants' coats. It's not altogether a very convincing sight, and I have to say that of all the hunting pictures at Berkeley, it pales into insignificance beside the one over the fireplace. And here to explain it to me is James Sturton.
Well, Vicky, from the real world of Bricket Wood, we're now in the manicured landscape of George Stubbs. And this is really the gem of the sporting pictures in the house. It's the groom and two horses. And it is one of those wonderful pictures in which I think Stubbs reaches a classical perfection of horse painting that's never really been achieved before or since by any painters. I don't think he really wanted to be a horse painter originally. He was born in Liverpool, of all places, and then went to Lincolnshire, where he wrote his Anatomy of Horses. And after that, his patrons refused to think of him as anything except a horse painter, although I think he really wanted to paint history pictures and more lucrative portraits. But I think his patrons must have been right in their choice, and I think history has vindicated that. And today we think of Stubbs really as the perfect illustration of the English idea of the thoroughbred. Apart from horses and hunting, the other great obsession of this most English of families was, of course, ships and the sea. Here we have a ship's portrait by William van der Velde the Elder of a family ship, the Tiger, commanded by Charles Lord Berkeley. And as you can see from the inscription, he died on board in 1682, the year after he commissioned it. In the manner of ship's portraits, you can see the man of war in two positions, and I think probably even three positions.
Same ship.
Same ship, absolutely. The artist, William van der Velde, is another interesting example of a foreigner founding a branch of English painting. He is really the father of English marine painting. And I think this is even more remarkable because the time he was painting, we were almost continuously at war with his countrymen, the Dutch.
And it was considered quite all right to do that, was it? To sort of consort with the enemy and bespoke pictures from them?
Yes, I think that trade and war was one thing, but I think artists, we didn't have any artists very much in those days ourselves, so we had no alternative.
So would van der Velde have actually used models for these ships, or would he have taken drawings and studied those?
He used to go down to the docks at Deptford and Tilbury, for example, and there he'd fill his notebooks with every available ship in dock and use them later as and when required.
In a private corner is the castle's best spare bedroom, an amazing room which totally captivated my other expert, John Bly.
But then you look up at this wonderful ceiling, look at those magnificent timbers, and you get this feeling of inspiration from the past. And then you come round and you see what was in those days the most important piece of furniture in the house, let alone the room, the bed, the great bed. This shape, which we call cup and cover, turning, it means automatically that it should be, providing it's genuine, from the Elizabethan period. So any time between 1550, 1600 as far as antique furniture is concerned, that is when this bed was made.
You see, that would worry me, not knowing anything about furniture, as you well know.
Why?
The thing that really concerns me is the fact that it looks terribly clean and tidy. I mean, there's no marks or dirt or grease or anything on it. And also the carving is very precise and very neat and tidy. I would have thought that was much too technically advanced for that date.
Yes, well, you see, at this time, this is a common mistake. When you see these things copied in the 19th century, they attempted to make things look crude because they thought that's how it would look out, or would have done, had it been ancient. In fact, they were highly skilled craftsmen. And as you see from many of these figures, they have a sort of Germanic look. The finest carvers at this time were Germans. They came over, itinerant workmen, and encouraged this fine quality carving on, obviously, either churches or the best of English furniture. As to the colour, well, there's no reason why it should have got dirty. It stood here for 500 years or 300 years. I know what you mean, but there is no question of this. This is quite magic. The quality of this, just look at these wonderful formalised acanthus leaves. I think they look more like Chinese lettuce leaves.
Yes, they do.
But so real, so lifelike. And in complete contrast, you see above that is this very architectural cut card work, very formal. Now, if you think you've got that at Burley on the Elizabethan staircase, haven't you? Up both sides and over the arch.
Yep.
Well, then if they could do it in stone, they could do it in wood.
Ah, but our stone is very black and very sooty, proving that it's old. If it's dirty, it must be earth.
I've got no answer for that one, I'm afraid. What are the bed strains?
Well, this is absolutely this is what I've been sort of gazing at. Of course, you look at a bed like this Elizabethan one and you think, gosh, could the bed cover be Elizabethan? But I'm sure it's not. I'm sure it's 18th century. This very, very fine lawn embroidered here, but these wonderful colours. Sadly, they've been exposed to the daylight on the top, and you just don't get this lovely glow.
And of course the headboard's the same material, above which is this remarkable architectural headboard. And look at the roof, and let's mention the roof. Geometric mouldings, panelled out by a man who joined the timbers together. And the man who made the ceiling in panel rooms obviously made these huge covers for beds, or testers. But this, the official name for this is a full tester bed. When you've got half a canopy, it's a half tester bed.
How do you half test a bed?
But it's an extraordinary fine example. It really is absolutely wonderful. And the sort of guilloche moulding round the diamond, and the fleur-de-lis. Everything is on here. You could write a book about this bed. It is so good. It's full of everything. Because one of the things that Berkeley's noted for is its collection of chairs representing several periods. And my favourite example, I think, is this, not a chair, in fact, it's a daybed. Seat furniture, anyway. But look at it. I mean, it is so lovely. Here is a 1665 gentleman. I can almost see Charles II reclining on this with his frills and these beautiful legs. They do reflect the costume of the time. They do reflect their attitudes to life. I think it's wonderful. Each of those little legs is meant to represent a tassel, formalised tassel, and the whole thing has life, and it has life of the period. Now, a very good example of what I was saying earlier about chairs reflecting people and their shapes. It's a very good way of looking at life and history, just looking at chairs when you can find the right pieces. Here I've got two side chairs. Now, the first one, en suite with the settee, has identical legs, and again ebonized, the stretchers joining the legs, and it was a turbulent period. It was great fun, flamboyance, show, display, wealth, as much as you could get, and you flaunted it. Here it is. Here is the chap. Now, in 1700 to 1710, we'd had the restoration of the monarchy, we'd had Charles II, James II, William and Mary, and then we had Queen Anne. And everything quietened down, like the calm before the storm. Before the Whig government was to take us into another period of turmoil, it was peaceful. And that's how the furniture became. And it became, instead of knobbly and curly and tassely, it calmed down to curvilinear. No stretchers connecting the legs at all. No decoration, but everything in line, everything curvilinear, beautiful, serene, solid, reliable. That was England at the beginning of the 18th century. That was the people. Here's a good Queen Anne chair. Here's a Queen Anne person sitting.
Looks rather like Queen Anne, sort of short.
Looks rather like Queen Anne, yes. But what a beautiful shape, style, and yet peace and quiet. And very exciting and lovely to see such examples in one house.
Thank you.